Denise Robitaille is the author of 13 books, including her latest, ISO 9001 2015 Handbook for Small and Medium-Sized Businesses. She is chair of PC 302 and an active member of US tagged ISO TC 176. She's participated internationally in standards development for more than 15 years. Denise, take it away.
Thanks very much, Laura. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on 9 keys to successful auditing. So what we basically want to do here is to look at some of the challenges and constraints and some of the things that we can do in order to avoid or to be able to get beyond some of those obstacles and to develop some practices that help us achieve the goal of having successful audits. So here they are, and we are going to look at them one at a time. So first key, planning and preparation. As you know, within any management system, with any project plans that you do, anything that you do, the better job you do of planning, the better the execution will be, the more effective things will be, and the more productive the outcome will be. Same is true for auditing. So when we look in terms of planning and preparation, we look at two different things. We look at planning the entire program, and we also look at planning for each individual audit. So let's talk about scheduling. The first key is to make sure that planning and preparation, in particular scheduling, is something that is done effectively. You know, a lot of people have audit schedules that basically say we do everything once a year. How effective is that in looking at your system and looking at those things that engender the greatest risk, that allow you to spend more time on those processes that have greater criticality for you, things where there's more change, much more dynamic, a lot of things in flux. You know, let's look at putting together an audit schedule that considers some of the following. What are the processes that you have, and what are those activities that need to be audited? How critical are some of those processes? If you are an organization where you design your own product and you do this based upon a new project every time, everything is brand spanking new every time. Well, there's a lot of dynamic activities going on in that. There's a lot of interesting things going on, and because of that, you have different players, different activities. That is a critical process, a lot of moving parts, a lot of ancillary processes tied to it. That would be an example of a process that has greater criticality. You might decide that it would have greater frequency. Other things that you look at in terms of deciding that schedule and planning that schedule is the result of previous audits. What have the previous audits shown us? What are the reports telling us? Do we have some that show there's a lot of non-conformances? This particular process really needs a bit more scrutiny. It needs a little bit more vigilance on our part. Or the opposite. We've looked at this process for 4 years. Every time we go in and look at this process, it is not one of the critical processes. We have a very mature staff. We never have any findings. There really isn't any benefit in doing this audit more than once a year. So looking at that frequency, using that in order to determine your frequency. If you look at ISO 9001 in particular, it talks about the things that should help you determine what the frequencies are. And you know, the other thing in there is changes to your system. Have you added a new process? Have you added a new product? Other things to include in your schedule, consideration of multiple shifts. See, many organizations who don't audit the off shifts, who, for example, never audit the 11 to 7 shift. Or if they're auditing the second shift, they audit at 3:30 because everybody starts at 3. The unfortunate thing about that is you don't get to audit that particular process or those processes that occur on that shift after all the support people in the office have left. So you ask the question, what happens if? A lot easier to see what happens when those supports are no longer present. What happens at night that might not happen during the day or happens at 8 o'clock at night? You know, what are some of those things that they are challenged with that are not challenges that happen during the day. Something to be considered. And finally, when you're scheduling, you have to look at resources. And one of the biggest resources you look at is the availability of your auditors. And that's something that you need to ensure that you engage top management in that conversation to make sure that your auditors have available, that their supervisors know that this is a commitment that the organization has, and we have to make auditors available. Other resources to make sure that the auditors have accessibility to the documented information that they need in order to conduct the audit. So those are all the considerations that might go into planning. Again, as you look at resources, some of the things you look at, you're going to have audit teams going out or single auditors. This, again, is a function of how many auditors do you have, what kind of constraints do you have on their time. How many trained auditors do you have? And the training of auditors is also a resource. You also have to make sure that they are able to maintain their objectivity. So there's a little bit of planning that goes into that to do a mix and match, make sure that the auditors that we have can maintain adequate objectivity when they are auditing processes. The ISO 9001 standard has backed off from saying that auditors cannot audit their own work, but basically says you still have to maintain objectivity. Well, and the final thing, obviously, is time constraints. What kind of constraints do you have on the auditor's time, on the process owner's times? All of these things go into the planning. Here's an example of a typical schedule that takes into account some of these things that we talked about, criticality of processes. The other thing is also you want to have some sense of process approach. So, for example, if you look in the first yellow column, it says purchasing, and then it says receiving directly under it. Well, the output of the purchasing process is the input into the receiving process. So you can look at those two sequentially. So if one team goes in and does those two, they can look at these are the purchase orders. This is the receiving activities. If there were, for example, requirements for certificates of analysis that are indicated on the purchase orders, is there evidence that those were received? Those kinds of things you get to look at when you're looking at these kind of sequential processes. Next, you see that production and inspection are together. There's some organizations who think that inspection is something that should be done separately. However, inspection is the activity that verifies fulfillment of the requirements within the production process. So again, appropriate to do those together. You can see the way this is set up. You've got one team doing them in January, another team doing these in October. So the expectation is that you've got two different teams doing these, so you also get different eyes looking at it. There are some things that are only in the schedule once or twice, whereas some things are done fairly frequently. And you get to decide that. You'll see in the right-hand column you have the QMS processes, management review, corrective action, data analysis. Those get done only once a year because the manner in which those are implemented makes it easier to do only once a year, and there's not a whole bunch of compelling reason to do it more frequently. You also have some that, as you can see, happen every time. You always look at documents and records. That's right across the board for every audit, because for every audit that you do, you're always going to have that documented information. You're always going to have documents and records. So those are examples of things that you consider as you put your audit schedule together. The other thing is you see software development is only done once a year. Perhaps this is not a major activity. Maybe it's a small portion of the business, not done as frequently. And so you see also the second shift is done only once a year. Second shift is not as large, but we want to make sure we cover them at least once a year. All of those things are examples of things that you can consider as you put your schedule together. The other half of planning and preparation is preparing for each individual audit. And that means things like, for example, ensuring that people read the documents and the procedures before they go out into the area where they're going to be conducting their audits, that they create a checklist. And we've got a separate section where we're going to be talking about the development of checklists. You encourage those auditors to look at the previous audit report. What was the information that was there? What were the good practices that were observed? What were the risks that were perceived that hadn't reached the threshold of nonconformance yet? And then finally, are there any corrective actions coming from anywhere, either from a customer complaint or from a previous audit, that are due for closeout? And this is a great time to do verification of effectiveness corrective actions, because you're looking to see whether or not the process is effective. And if part of the corrective action involved making an improvement to that process, making some revisions to it, you actually get more bang for your buck, because you're closing out the corrective action at the same time as you are verifying the continued effectiveness of the process. Making sure that as you plan these audits, that you plan and make sure that you have enough time. And one of the things with this is making sure that your auditors are also trained in good time management. Beyond that, there are constraints and challenges. You know, people set up audits, and it's not always what is convenient for the auditee, the individuals being audited, that is also convenient for an auditor. An auditor may try to schedule their audits over their lunchtime because they're really, really, really busy. Unfortunately, that happens to be the lunchtime for some of the people that they also wish to audit. Similarly, things like breaks. You don't want them going out there and get out there and everybody just went on break. You want to make sure that you know when that break happens. If there are weekly meetings, if there are scheduled trainings, you need to know that ahead of time, or else you're going to show up to your audit. People aren't going to be there. So plan ahead of time. Ask these questions. If you're planning to do an audit of the receiving function, you want to make sure that you're out there when those trucks arrive so that you can observe that process. However, if you're looking at the shipping function, you may not want to be there at the exact moment that they're trying to get everything out the door. You might be there half an hour earlier to look at how they prep for when all of those trucks arrive and they start loading all of their outgoing shipments onto the truck. If you have multiple buildings, you have to figure in time to travel between each site. Sometimes it's only 10 minutes to walk to another building. Sometimes it's half an hour to drive to, the warehouse that is, across town. All of these go into that planning of your audit. So that was the first T, planning, planning, planning. The second one, drive out fear. Remember, Deming directed us all. Drive out fear. It applies to the audit process as surely as it does to any others. What are some of the things that you can do? First of all, you start with top management and you communicate that audits are a welcome opportunity to improve. The absolute best example I've ever seen of that was when I was conducting a training for a company, and early on in the training, the vice president walked into the company, into the training room, and interrupted the training. It was early, we were in the early stages of it, and said to the people being trained, "Thank you for agreeing to being one of our auditors. Thank you for sitting through this training. We need your help. We need the observations that you're going to give us. We appreciate the work that you're going to be doing." That is probably the single most extraordinary thing that top management can do to ensure that everybody knows that audits are an important part of the system and that there's no negatives involved in it. Top management must also provide the necessary resources. Sometimes that's just a matter of making sure that those supervisors know that regardless of how busy they are, if they've got an auditor in their area, say, there's an internal auditor coming. We want to make sure that you tell that person that it's okay for them to leave their particular job and go and do their audit, because that's an important thing for us. Make sure they have access to what they need. Make sure that there are resources, monetary resources provided to make sure they get adequate training. Ensure that there are no punitive actions taken for audit findings. People should not feel as though they are going to be punished if there is a finding in their area. In all the years I've done this work, there has only been one instance where I discovered that the organization was using audit findings as part of people's annual performance review, and I was horrified. That's a dreadful, dreadful thing to do. Quite frankly, findings is how we learn things. This is how we can improve. A lot of times things change. It's not that people are screwing up, people have gotten lazy, or people have been distracted. It's simply that things have changed. And because we are so busy, things are so dynamic, we are not always vigilant to make sure that we capture the consequences of all these changes. And that's where some of these nonconformances arise. And so the actions that are taken to address those will, more often than not, usually in most cases, will result in improvement. So those things should be welcome rather than treated as an opportunity for punitive action. Always encourage your auditees to be truthful and open and thorough. None of this, don't volunteer any information. Speak honestly about what you do. And then I've got my last bit down here, and it is in red and it's bolded. There are several organizations who still have as one of their quality objectives zero findings. That is one of the most fruitless and pointless quality objectives you can possibly have. If you have findings, you have findings. It means that you're going to uncover things that require attention that will ultimately allow you to experience improvement. There is no upside to counting how many findings you had during an audit. So that's the story around driving out fear. Audit program managers, publish the audit schedule. Don't make it a secret. Let everybody know when the audits are happening. Auditors, beware of be conscious of your attitude, your body language, how you talk to people. If you're finding nonconformances, tone down the rhetoric. Avoid the aha, look what I found kind of thing. It's just a matter of, oh, look at this. This doesn't match your requirements. Okay, I think I'm going to have to write this up, and, we're going to have to do something about this, not to worry about. Use effective interviewing techniques. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And finally, never leave an area without saying thank you. Just regardless of what everybody's job is, they have extended you the courtesy of responding to your questions. And just say thank you. So that was the second key. Make sure that you drive the fear out of this process. The third key, make sure that people have adequate training. I've had people say to me, we have somebody who shadows one of our auditors for one audit, and then they become auditors for the second one. That is not adequate training. There are a lot of things that go into being an auditor, talking about the code of conduct, talking about confidentiality, talking about time management. All of these things have to be trained, how to put together a good checklist. Things like process approach, understanding that interrelation of processes, that if you're looking at, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the purchasing function, how does that connect to the receiving function? How does that connect to anything you have to do in terms of traceability of materials? Things are connected. How do you assess the integrity of those links as you are doing an audit? Make sure that they have some communication skills and they get some training on interviewing. Teach them about sampling. You don't go out and look just one thing. Well, how many things do you look at? Well, it depends. And so you teach them a little bit more about sampling and about looking at that evidence to figure out whether or not that evidence is really actually providing you with the ability to conclude that a process is well controlled. And then teach them how to write an audit report. It doesn't have to be a complicated thing. We'll talk about that later. But, these are the things that go into making sure that you have good auditors, ensure that they are well trained. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. There's great things. American Society for Quality, ASQ, has their CQA program. That's a great example. There are a lot of good third-party providers who can either come in-house and do a training, or there's some things that you can send people to, or you can do it internally if you have a person inside who is qualified to train them. But they should have some training. And there is never any excuse to have people out there who aren't trained, because if you don't have trained auditors, it significantly diminishes the effectiveness of your audit program. So creating an effective checklist is the fourth key. What do you want to consider? What needs to go into that checklist? The checklist is basically where you write down, this is what I want to know. So you've got your requirements. You say, oh, these are the requirements, and they're found in a whole bunch of different places. So here we have an example of the requirements for purchasing. So, and it includes qualification of suppliers and acceptance of product. So see all of these inputs, all those arrows on the left, you have to ensure that the purchased product conforms to the requirements. You got to make sure that it's being purchased from qualified suppliers. How do you do that? When you're buying the materials or the services, are the documents that are generated to do that, do they provide adequate information? When you receive the material in, does the material that you receive in, does it match what was on the purchase order? And what are the monitoring activities? What do you do to monitor your suppliers to make sure that they are fulfilling your requirements? So those are all the things that your inputs, all those requirements that you need to verify. So what activities are tied to these? This is what you're going to go out and audit, because all of these things on the left is like, well, that's really interesting, but how the heck do I connect the dots to that? So you create an audit checklist that looks at things like, oh, I'm going to have to look at how do we go about requesting quotations from our suppliers? What are the methods that we use for supplier qualification? Oh, according to the procedures that I happen to have reviewed, these are the different ways we do this. I want to see evidence of that. Purchased materials, what's on the purchase order? Are the specifications correct? If we have very tight delivery requirements, how are those monitored? When the product comes in, is there a traceability requirement? How is that handled? Are the monitoring methods for our suppliers, are they effective? Do they give us good information? After you have asked the questions of all of these activities, then over to the right, you have the output. So are the outputs of all these activities effective? Is this an effective process? So you want to create a checklist that says, these are the things I want to understand. These are the activities that are going to allow me to answer that question. And here's what I'm hoping to conclude. And I will write into my report whether or not I'm able to conclude that. Think of it also in terms of process approach. So determine those requirements. They're selecting suppliers, confirming the purchasing information, and you can read as well as I. And there's the whole process as you go all the way through. And if you come to the end of that and you may decide we have to select a new supplier. So as you conduct the audit, you're going to want to go through all of these steps. So that is all the stuff that you want to think about as you are creating your checklist. You might actually create one of these little charts here, depending on what activity it is that you are auditing. So that's the fourth key. Key number 5, make sure that you hone your interviewing skills. Again, something in red. You must remember that the individuals that you are interviewing were not hired to answer your questions. It just doesn't come up during the interview, during their hiring interview. They were hired to do their jobs. And frankly, the better job they can do of answering the questions in the language that they used in order to be able to get the job done, the higher should be your level of confidence that they know what they're talking about. If they're talking in ISO speak, and if they're quoting, chapter and verse out of the procedure, then maybe they just reviewed that the night before, so they'd be able to give you what they think is the right answer. So you want to tell them what it is that you're going to be interviewing them on. Now, this is really important, especially in small organizations where you have people who wear multiple hats. And the very ubiquitous example is the shipper-receiver. People who do shipping often are also the people who do receiving. However, using the example that we've had so far, we talk about purchasing and receiving. So we want to go out and talk to a particular individual. We need for that individual to understand we are here to talk about the receiving aspect of his job. So they may have issues with the shipping end of stuff going out, and they keep wanting to distract you and to direct the conversation in that direction because they have something they want to talk about, and you have to keep pulling them back in and saying, well, we're talking about receiving here. Tell them if you're going to observe their work. It's a creepy feeling to have somebody stand behind you and realize all of a sudden that they've been watching you for 5 minutes. Don't do it to them. Just let them know. It's like, I've got this checklist here. It says that you do all of these things, and I just want to watch you do it. That's it. No big deal. Ask open-ended questions. Try very hard to ask questions that are going to give you something other than a yes or no answer. Now, this is often difficult to do because a lot of times that's how you tee up a new subject. By saying, do you do this? And they're going to say yes or no. So you can't really avoid that yes or no question. But the next one after that is, show me how you do it. How do you do that? What do you use to do that? Always give the auditees an opportunity to explain what they do. Sometimes it just takes a little while for them to just put their thoughts together properly. Remember, they weren't hired to answer your questions. So don't jump in if they don't answer you as quickly as you'd like for them to. And finally, don't steer them towards your opinion of what they should be saying. It's like, so the next thing that you do is you put those parts over there to be painted. And they're thinking, that's not what I do, but if that's what the auditor wants to hear. So don't steer them towards that because they're thinking maybe that's the right answer, and it's not. They know what they're doing with that. That's definitely not what they do. So try to keep that objectivity in the manner in which you address your question. Remember to suggest scenarios, like what would happen if. It's always great to understand, to know whether or not people know what to do if something unexpected happens or something that is out of the norm. It actually raises the confidence of their comprehension of the process. Ask them how they do things, because sometimes there's more than one way to do things. And as we know, sometimes there's 2 or 3 ways and they're all right. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 ways and only one of them is right. Depends. Ask people what happens next. You can, we call that following the audit trail. And, always show them, always ask them to say, show me. That's one of the easiest things you can do. They start talking about something, and especially if they're having trouble describing it, you say, well, just show me. Do the next one. Let's see how it looks. Again, with this key of honing your interviewing skills, the other half of interviewing is listening. So practice your listening skills. Ensure that you're hearing what people are saying. Sometimes, people's lips are moving and we're hearing what we want to hear rather than what they're actually saying. So really remain focused, remain present to the person that you are interviewing and hear what they are saying to you. One of the really neat tricks is to nod a lot. And what that does is it's this nonverbal cue that makes them think or indicates to them that you are interested in what you have to say. When people feel that you're interested, they are willing to explain further, to go into greater detail. It raises their confidence. It lowers any inhibitions they have about speaking with you. So it's a really easy technique to use. Just nod when people are responding to you. So that is tip number 5 for having successful audits. Hone your interviewing skills. And one final point on that is not everyone has equal comfort with interviewing. So sometimes you have someone who's really good at understanding procedures, they understand documentation, they understand sampling, they understand the concept of conformance to requirements, but asking people, not so good. So they've got some of the skills. So you may have to have someone coach them into these other skills that are not, that they're not as comfortable with. All right, on to our next key, managing the audit team. If you've got a short audit, you may only have one person. Not a big deal. Other times, you have one or two people. So some of the things that you do is you decide ahead of time what you're going to do. Sometimes you have two people who go in to the audit, and you just decide ahead of time who's going to ask what questions. Somewhere along that, you should swap off. You shouldn't have one person do all of the interviewing and the other person just taking notes. Make sure that there's a back and forth there, because you both have different perspectives on things. If you have a longer audit, like if your organization does audits where you send out multiple teams on one day or over a 2-day period, then plan to meet at some point to discuss some concerns. A typical example of that would be if 2 or 3 teams all observe the same thing relating to control of documented information. If it's only in one particular area, it might not look like it's a big deal, but if you observe the same thing in 3 different areas, in engineering, it's the control of engineering change notices from customers, and you go into production and it's the control of the travelers, and then you go somewhere else and you become aware of the fact that there is a systemic problem having to do with document control. That is a more critical finding, something that requires greater attention, and it will definitely make a difference in terms of the final audit report. So it's important to discuss that. So good communication, making sure that people are talking about what they're observing during the course of the audit. You may have to adjust the schedule. Someone, just because of the nature of things, sometimes things take longer. You may have to adjust things and swap out some tasks. And so you do that in a controlled manner by doing it during a meeting. Also, if you're on an audit team, remember that your fellow auditors and the lead auditor has to read your notes. So they have to be clear. There's got to be enough of them. I had an auditor once who spent an entire day auditing, and when I talked to him at the end of the day, because I was the lead auditor, all he had was notes on one nonconformance, and he had audited all day long. I had no idea what else he had looked at. Got to make sure that you have adequate notes so that the lead auditor can put together an audit report, and so if some of these discussions arise about whether or not there are concerns, you've got objective evidence to substantiate that. And again, they have to be legible because someone needs to read your notes. So all of these things go into managing that audit team, an important thing to ensure the effectiveness. Sometimes this can cause things to fall apart. The final thing to remember with an audit team is if you have a lead auditor, and if you have an audit team, there must always be a lead auditor. That person directs a team. If there are 2 individuals who have different opinions as to whether or not something is a nonconformance or an opportunity for improvement, the lead auditor is the one who makes the final decision as to whether it is an actual nonconformance or it is an OFI, or sometimes the difference between whether it's a major or a minor. Whatever is the system that your organization has, the lead auditor is the one who makes the call. The lead auditor is also the person who conducts the closing meeting. A competent lead auditor may ask one of the auditors in the room to comment on a finding or on something in particular that was observed as a courtesy, and that's a really good practice, and it shows respect for the other team members. However, it is the lead auditor who conducts that, and they run that closing meeting. The lead auditor is also the one who is responsible for the writing of the audit report. So that is key number 6. Make sure that you manage that audit team. Key number 7, write an informative report. Unfortunately, we have a lot of folks who think that an audit report is just a listing of all the bad things that were found, all those NCs. There are no nonconformances, everything's great. So there are a lot of other things that should be in an audit report. That doesn't mean it has to be lengthy, but you must write an informative report. And it has to convey a balance. It can't look like the company's running amok. So things that you will do, you will mention good practices that were observed. Part of this, flows, all these audit reports, or a summary of them, will flow into management review as an input to the management review process. Remember how earlier on we talked about one of those driving out fears to have top management endorse the audit program. Well, one of the things that justifies their ability to support the audit program is that they get good information from it. There's a benefit that the company derives from the audit report and from the audit program. So one of the things it might be is these are some of the good things that we saw. Gives the opportunity for top management to look to see if these practices can be benchmarked, if they create other opportunities for improvement. So it's good to say those. Risks that have been perceived. Risk has become a really big buzzword across all management system standards. It's always been a really good thing to look at during audit. So within that audit, these sometimes are your opportunities for improvement. Sometimes they're called potential nonconformances. It's a good idea to couch them in the language of, this is a risk that is perceived. We're not really sure this is a nonconformance, but there is a risk that was perceived. Gives management the opportunity to decide whether or not further action should be taken. And then finally, we have that which most people are accustomed to seeing, which is the problems. These are the problems that were identified. These are the things that require either correction or corrective action. So that is, the high level on writing that report. Some of the things, the other thing to remember is when you write up the nonconformance, you've got to make sure that it's written in language that allows the people who need to take action on it to understand clearly what the problem is. So a nonconformance always has 3 things in it. It always says what is wrong. The contract doesn't match the traveler that was sent out to the manufacturing facility. That's what's wrong. Well, what are the requirements? Well, the requirements are found in your contract review work instructions that say you do all these checks and you make sure that you check all these things. So when we looked at that, all of those requirements are found in our procedure QP 478-3. And then what was the evidence? So the evidence was found in, we were looking at customer PO number XJ47-H and traveler 735996. That is the evidence. So 3 things. What's wrong? What are the requirements? And chapter and verse on that. This is procedure, blah, 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 and it is in section 5.3, and that procedure is at Rev C. And what is the evidence? Be specific, because now you give whoever has to take action on this adequate information so that they can take meaningful, efficient, effective action, either correction or corrective action. So writing a meaningful report, 2 things: make sure you've got good information in it, and also if you have to write up nonconformances, that they are clearly stated. Number 8, take action on the findings. If you're not going to do anything based upon the findings, then the audit report is meaningless. What's the point? What are some of the actions? You might do correction. Just a small thing needs to be fixed. Might be corrective action. Need to do root cause analysis. Need to develop an action plan, et cetera, et cetera. We need to do preventive action, which is now for some people. Some people are still calling them preventive actions. Other people are referring to them as actions to address risks. And any improvement initiatives that might have been suggested if there was an OFI, an opportunity for improvement that was cited. any of those things that are cited in there that require action, it is imperative that action is taken. Without that, the audit is pointless. Report back to management. I have seen management review records that show that all it says was that we got all our audits done in accordance with the audit schedule. End of sentence. We did the entire audit of the system 6 months ago, period. That's it. What do you want top management to know about your internal audit? Well, you want to know about the status of the organization. When we looked at this, and you can do it in summary form, or depending on the culture within your organization, how many audits you do, and how involved top management gets in the management review process, you might review all of the internal audits. I've got some small companies that do that. Or it might be a summary. These are the things that we observed. We had all of these things that show that overall, most of our processes conform to requirements. We're in really good shape with a lot of these things. This is the list of risks that we have identified. And some of these we've already taken action on, and some of these others we needed to wait until management review to find out whether or not top management thinks that we should do that, because it might involve more resources than we have. These are the problems that came up. These are the non-conformances. These are the ones that have already been resolved, so we don't have to worry about the customer complaining about these things, or these are the ones that are still in the works and we haven't been able to really get that. We might need more resources, we might need more time. These things are a real bugaboo. Effectiveness of actions from previous audits. Last year, we did 8 audits. We had 3 findings. Those 3 findings, when we took action on those things, we were able to improve 4 processes. That cut down our returns on a particular product line by 5%, which saved us $20,000. That's an extraordinary conversation to have that validates for top management how important those internal audits can be. And finally, you've got, again, the opportunities for improvement. As part of the audits, there were these opportunities for improvement. Some of them have been acted on. Others, leaving it to top management to determine whether or not we should take action. But make sure that good information gets back to top management. This is the reciprocity. Top management extends you the confidence that you can do the job. They give you the resources. They support you verbally, and they give you what you need in order to do the audit. What you give them back is good information so that you can be catalysts for change within the organization, so that good things can happen in the organization as a result of your audit. And that is how you end up having successful audits. So we covered all of this: investment and support, making sure that the reports are informative and compelling. So let's take a look at this. This is how it looks if you follow it as a trail. You've got your audit program well planned. You've put in place this practice to make sure there's no fear in it. You make sure that the people are trained. You have effective checklists so that when you go out, you can ask effective questions. You can have a productive interview and you're not wasting time. You do that partially by having good interviewing skills. You make sure that if you're working as a team, that the team actually does work well together. You write a good report. You take action on those findings, and you report back to management. And that comes full circle. It gets management the opportunity to look at the effectiveness of the audit program and whether or not they want to make any changes or any enhancements to that program. I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will turn it back over to Laura.
Thanks, Denise. This ends today's presentation. Have a wonderful day.